All right, so we are going to continue with our symposium, and our next speaker is Professor Ana Llinares, who teaches or works for Universidad Autónoma de Madrid here in Spain. She teaches second language acquisition and content and language integrated learning, both at the undergraduate and postgraduate level. She coordinates the UAM CLIL, Universidad Autónoma de Madrid CLIL research group, and she's published extensively on CLIL at primary and secondary levels, school levels. She's now Vice Chair of the European COST project, which stands for CLIL Network for Languages in Education towards multilingual disciplinary literacies. And she's the co-editor of the Journal of Immersion and Content-Based Language Education. Thank you very much, Professor Llinares, for coming today, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for your lovely introduction, and thank you, Yolanda, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here with these wonderful scholars, colleagues, and friends. So it's a real pleasure to always be back to this campus and this university. Okay, so the focus of my talk here is this, challenging sort of idea of enhancing collaboration between what we do in research and what teachers do. And I'm not talking about, okay, researchers working on educational aspects such as CLIL. We do our research and then we share it with teachers. No. What I mean is teachers really actually participating in research studies. And in a way, it's similar to Dario's work with the teachers, right? So they are researchers as well as not just providing us with data and information, but they're actually researchers themselves. So a couple of years ago, in an article on the sort of retrospective and prospective gains and challenges in CLIL, we thought about some of the targets in the SDG quality education and how CLIL could contribute, and whether what is being done in CLIL in terms of research and practice align with these targets, right? And so we found this target referring to universal literacy and numeracy. Literacy is important. This target mainly refers to functional literacies, right? So that children learn how to read and write, right? So that was there. So literacy is something that Teresa has referred to, Dario, so we've been talking about literacy, and it is reflected in the SDG quality education. Another target says education for sustainable development and global citizenship. Of course, global citizenship entails working with different languages, right? And also somehow indirectly refers to literacy, because if we want our future citizens to manage both in terms of both professionally and also maybe even also academically, you know, some students, they leave school, they study at universities abroad, or they develop academic sort of activities later on, and others, they function professionally, and in all cases they need to be able not only to speak English in a sort of functional way, but they need to also use the English for, as Teresa was referring to, you know, communicating with colleagues and reading and writing academic texts. Okay, another target 4.4, referred to increasing the number of people with relevant skills for financial success. I was a little bit shocked when we read that about financial success. But when you read this target in detail, it refers to critical thinking and it refers to teamwork, right? So with all these ideas here, I wanted to sort of, in this talk, bring together the focus on literacies, and we're going to see in a minute what we mean by literacy. It's a very complex concept, including critical thinking and also teamwork, collaborative work between teachers, with students, with researchers, right? So this is the overall thing. Right, so if we leave teamwork a little bit aside for the moment, a lot of work has been done recently on literacies in CLIL. So we have, okay, functional literacies, they have been, and they're being addressed in the language class, reading and writing, in general English, different languages. This is something that is being done and has been done, has always been done in the English class. Then we have disciplinary literacies, which are more specific of a content class, right? So we're talking about literacy, language that is relevant for a specific subject. And Teresa exemplified very nicely, the language that is needed for chemistry, right? And for specific topics in chemistry. Then we have general academic literacy, which applies both to the content and the English class, and the language class. We're not talking only about the specific language for specific disciplines, but academic language that can be applied to different disciplines, right? Not just one discipline. And then we have critical thinking and deeper learning, and we have a pluraliteracies model that was developed by Doe and Oliver Mayer that encompasses even better the complexity of the different types of literacies. And more recently, and of course in different languages, more recently, I hope you can see, well, it's very small, but I will tell you in briefly, what these dimensions entail. In a recent work within a European course project involving many researchers from many European countries, and Teresa is one of the leaders of one working group. So there has been work drawing on insights from different contexts so what do we mean by literacies in bilingual, multilingual contexts. And new dimensions came up, of course, the technological dimension and the multimodal dimension, apart from these other aspects that we've already discussed. I'll come back to these three in a minute. So we see that literacies, the concept of literacy is very complex, right? And it incorporates many, many aspects. Right, so what do we do about teamwork and literacies? We have all these approaches to literacies, and then we want to really carry out collaborative work. In SLA, so in second language acquisition research, some years ago, Sato and Loven talk about the importance of incorporating teachers in the research activity, being actively involved in research, and the idea that teachers really demanded this context to learn about and to develop better their pedagogical ideas. And in CLIL, we also looked at that in the context of looking at literacies from a perspective of the content teachers, the language teachers, and researchers using a multidisciplinary approach to try to come to some sort of shared understanding. So how can we so we know it's important. It's important to create these communities of practice, both in SLA, it's been observed, but also in CLIL. So how can we get CLIL teachers more actively involved in research, and what is the effect of this collaboration in students' learning and production, because this is at the end of the day what we want to achieve. Okay, so we thought then in our research group about whether the research that we were doing and the models that we were using to sort of understand or figure out whether the students were developing their disciplinary literacies in CLIL could be useful or not to work together with those models with the teachers, right? Because the models that researchers use sometimes, most of the times, they're too abstract for teachers, and so we thought, well, if we really want them to be involved in the actual research, we need to use the same models somehow. But how do you translate models that are very abstract for research into more applicable models? So, okay, so for disciplinary literacies, for example, there has been work for many years on genres and registers. So what are the specific types of text that are used in different subjects, and what is the language that is used for those specific types of texts? And some years ago, we we published this book, The Roles of Language in CLIL. It's already, well, very old. And we looked at the different genres that are relevant for different subjects, and also the language that is required to be, to be able to perform in those genres. So just to give you an example, for example, in school history, these are the main genres in school history, the purposes of those genres. So for example, it is very different to ask the students to produce a historical recount where they have to tell historical events that happened in the past, compared to if you ask them to write or read or present orally a historical argument where they have to use evaluative language, right? So these are different text types with different purposes, and they require different language, right? Okay, so and this is an example of more specifically what kind of language is relevant for a historical recount. For example, the use of temporal links, the development from specific to generic participants, the use of nominalizations. In a historical argument, you need evaluative lexis, modal expressions, conditionals. Okay, so you go from a broader sort of focus, which is the genre on the purpose, and then the specific language features that are necessary. So we use that for our own research, and we thought, well, this could be useful for teachers, right? And in fact, genre pedagogy has been applied a lot in many countries. And of course, it requires a lot of translation, meaning translation into language, meta-language that is understood by teachers, but it's been used. So we thought, oh well, we can use it maybe in CLIL as well. Right. For general academic literacy, we're talking really about disciplinary literacies, but not specifically focusing on specific subjects, but in a more general way. We found 3 models that we found useful for our own research, and we thought, well, let's see if they're useful also to work with teachers. Cognitive discourse functions by Christiane Dalton-Puffer, and Dario referred to that in that model in his presentation. Legitimation code theory, it's a sociological model that looks at the semantics, not the linguistics and the language, just the meanings, the semantics. And systemic functional linguistics. Again, that theory that I referred to before, that looks at genres and registers, but it has many other aspects as well. It looks at language really as totally related and interconnected with content, so language as inseparable from meanings and content. Okay, so, we started working with CDFs, cognitive discourse functions, because we also saw it was a good bridge between the level of genres and the level of the lexicogrammar, and also because we saw, as Christiane Dalton-Puffer saw also in her research, that really teachers were really working more with cognitive discourse functions rather than with whole genres and texts with different stages. Especially, we're talking of course about primary and secondary school level. The university level, tertiary level, of course students work with longer texts, but this was not the case really in the context that we were looking at, where students were asked to respond to questions rather than write a text with different stages. So this is the framework with the 7 different cognitive discourse functions. In our research, we looked at the performance, the students' performance in these different cognitive discourse functions. And just to give you an example, for example, definitions, we asked, in collaboration with teachers, students to respond to prompts where they were asked to, where they were pushed really to address different cognitive discourse functions. For example, here, this was in grade 6, sexto de primaria, and the students were asked to imagine that they were an advisor for Greenpeace and they were writing a blog. In the oral version, they had to participate in a radio program, and they were really asked to talk or write, but trying to encourage them or pushing them to respond to these different cognitive discourse functions, right? So for example, they were asked to define, they were asked to report, they were asked to describe, compare, explain, evaluate, etc. Let's continue with the example of define, just to follow just choosing one cognitive discourse function. In our research team, we looked at definitions, and we used different models to really look at the types of definitions that would be expected from students. So for example, some definitions typically contain a class, like in this case, community is a class, an ecosystem is a community formed by blah, blah, blah. And some students use the class and other students did not use the class. Like for example, in the example below, an ecosystem is like the different living things, right? So definitions can be more formal or less formal, right? Not including a class. Canonical definition would have the term, the class, and expansions, but not all students would use the class. We saw, for example, when they and it was interesting because we saw differences between the written and the spoken definitions that they used. They were more informal in the oral version, but they used more expansions in the oral version. So they added more information about the actual term that they were defining. So it was quite interesting. So we were seeing this, and then we wanted to check with teachers. So what do you expect from the students? Do you prefer that the definitions are formal, but maybe they don't add so much information, or that they're not so canonical, but the students are really showing better that they know about that term, right? So what is better, really? So we were doing this preliminary analysis ourselves, and we used a tool. This is a research tool to look at the types of definitions, the components of definitions. I don't expect you to read the details. It's just that you see how we did the analysis, right? So looking at all the definitions and then, right. And then we obtained some results. For example, we didn't see differences across languages. The students defined in English and in Spanish, and they either struggled in both or they were successful in both. We saw differences across subjects, and also in writing and speaking, as I mentioned, more formal in writing, but they used more expansions in speaking, so they expanded their core definition more. Right, so these are our results in terms of research. Then the other model that I referred to is LCT, Legitimation Code Theory, and this theory has different dimensions, and one is the semantic dimension. The semantic dimension has to do with how dense or simple concepts are presented and how abstract or contextualized they are presented. This is key in any classroom, right? So we don't want to be too simple, but if you're too simple, then the students may understand, but then, they're expected to use academic language. So to what extent we move from simple to dense, from contextualized to abstract and backwards. So, so this is just so that you see what it means. Weaker semantic gravity, we're talking about abstract, conceptual, or theoretical knowledge. Stronger semantic gravity is the meaning is more dependent on its context. For example, this is an example from history. International agreements is more abstract than the Treaty of Versailles, which is a specific international agreement. Okay. So this is about gravity, and about density. It has to do with how condensed meanings are. New technologies has stronger density than, for example, radios and cars. They're simple. They're more simple, right? And new technologies is more complex in terms of meaning compared to radios and cars. Just to give you an example of what we observed in classrooms, Carl Mayton talks about semantic waves and how important it is to move from contextualized simple to more abstract and dense, and then back to contextual and simple and abstract and dense. And this is what this teacher was doing in this little extract from a history class. I'm going to play it just very briefly. Oh, it did work before. It's not working now. When I tried it before, it did work. Well, if not, it's not so important, so I can skip it. Try again. Okay. No. Cuando lo he probado antes funcionaba.
Sí, pero como ha empezado a sacar ruidos, he quitado todo lo que estaba...
Bueno, déjalo, no pasa, tampoco es tan... Ah, es que he probado todo y digo, funciona, y ahora ya no. Sorry. Yo lo he probado y lo he escuchado. Okay, this is just for you to...
Consumption, people had
Okay, thank you. It's not working.
consumption, people had money to consume appliances, for example,
New
to travel.
technologies.
Sorry?
New technology.
New technologies such as radio, cars,
Radio, car.
The end of the world, World War.
peace. Peace, interesting guys, peace and also, end of the war and peace international agreements. So previous rivals, Germany with France and Britain, they could agree and they signed treaties, Treaty of Locarno and Treaty of Briançon, to condemn war as an instrument. No more war, peace, agreement, international agreement, economic growth.
Okay, so you can see here these waves that are co-constructed by the teacher and the students, you know, moving from the key terms that he wants them to remember, but also unpacking them, right, into more sort of everyday and contextualized examples. Okay, so we found, sorry, I think I have to go back to this. We found that this model, the semantic dimension of LCT, could be interesting also to use with teachers. We used it for our own research, but then, okay, it could work. Critical thinking and deeper learning, we also thought about these models again, cognitive discourse functions, SFL, LCT, and in two recent publications with my colleague Natalia Vnitskaya, we looked at the use of critical thinking and higher order thinking skills in a bilingual program in the Comunidad de Madrid, where students at the secondary school level are streamed into two different groups depending on their level of English. One group with more exposure to CLIL, like more subjects taught through English, another group with less exposure to CLIL, and that exposure is to subjects that are more practical and technological, not so academic, right? And there has been quite a lot of controversy about whether that raises inequity issues, in the sense that the streaming is not really only about language competence, it's about competence in general, right? So we wanted to look at, we were lucky to have the same teachers collaborating with us who were teaching in both groups, the higher exposure group and the lower exposure group, and we really wanted to see, when they're teaching the same topics, what happens in classroom interaction, right? Because they, informally told us, well, we don't do anything differently, really. And then, okay, but just let me know if you think we're doing something differently. So we were, you know, they opened their doors for us to do some research. So we used systemic functional linguistics, appraisal, the use of interpersonal language, the types of CDFs, and also the semantic dimension of LCT. And this is the context, this high exposure, low exposure groups. And what we found is, just to give you just in a nutshell, the interaction in the high exposure group included more evaluative aspects than with the low exposure group. Like the students were asked to give their opinion more than in the other group, where they were asked more factual questions. This was happening more in the high exposure group. The CDF evaluates, so arguing, giving opinion, justifying your opinion, was more present in the higher exposure group than in the lower exposure group, where describe was so more factual sort of type of approach to content was used. Then, using the semantic dimension, we saw that in the high exposure group, the teacher was using both semantic density plus, so high density, but also high gravity, so contextualized, so abstract but contextualized, dense but contextualized. So really, the teachers in the high exposure, and this happened in two subjects, technology and biology, with the same teacher teaching the same students in the high exposure group and the low exposure group. So we saw more of engagement into critical thinking, higher order thinking skills, through the lens of the CDFs, semantic dimension, and appraisal, the use of interpersonal language. So these tools were being helpful for us to see, you know, what is going on in lessons that they seemed in principle almost the same, but they weren't really the same, right? And this is what the teachers felt that they were doing. So now we come to teamwork, right? So what do we do with all these? Can we use all these models, all these theories, which are, well, relevant for research, but to what extent are they useful for practice and for collaborative work with the teachers? Can we use these models with them to be able to develop, work that can be, where content and language can be integrated and where content teachers, language teachers, and researchers can collaborate? So we developed 3 seminars in 3 consecutive years with teachers. And the first seminar, we added new things in each seminar, right? So the seminars were one-year seminars, including 6 sessions per year, once a month, right? So we had first session in November, then December, January. So 6 sessions throughout the school year, right? And the sessions were 2-hour sessions, okay? So before the first seminar, we needed to find a way of knowing teachers' perception, teachers' basis of achievement in terms of what they expected the students to do to perform well, right? And we wanted, of course, content teachers and English teachers, language teachers, basis of achievement. We wanted to see whether there are similarities or differences and whether they were compatible or they were totally incompatible. So we used this model for assessment, which is being used a lot in the UK. I don't know if, I guess, though, you're familiar with this comparative judgment, because it's been seen as a more objective tool than using rubrics, for example. And it consists of comparing texts written by the students responding to the same prompt, right? So one text is compared, so text and compared with multiple texts, right? And then you have a ranking of the results of the texts that were considered better or worse by multiple judges, right? So the judges are the teachers, they compare text, they choose the best one, they choose the best one in a sort of, let's say, they can write notes justifying why they decided that one text was better than the other one, but this would take a long time, so we didn't expect the teachers to write any notes. We just wanted to see, what the ranking was, and then talk with them about that ranking. But it's done in a sort of very sort of comprehensively, right? The machine compares each judgment of each text, and the machine produces a ranking. So why did we do that? Because it could make visible our intuition about the quality of the students' texts, or the teachers' intuitions about the quality of students' texts, and then facilitating dialogue between content and language teachers, and in our case also with us, researchers, the research group that had looked at these texts, also using research tools. Okay, so to compare two responses and choose the best one, compare responses with many different responses, and ranking of responses. So it was a multidisciplinary approach in the sense that the teachers looked at the text from their own perspective. So English teachers, we also used, also Spanish teachers participated. So they looked at the text from their discipline, okay, from the perspective of the discipline, and content specialists looked at the text from the perspective of their discipline. So it's multidisciplinary. It's not, so each doing it from their own field. This is what you get from with a ranking, with the machine produces a ranking, and it allows you to see, for example, things like this. This happened with one of a set of texts that we asked the teachers who collaborated with us to judge, and so you can see here science teachers' judgments of the text. The numbers here are the texts, and then you can see, for example, when texts are ranked low by both content teachers and language teachers, or high by both content teachers and language teachers, or here, for example, when there is a difference, and then you can really look at those texts and what is happening there, right? So that the machine produces these results, and then you need to work on the interpretation of those results. So, for example, this is an example of, if we continue with definitions, right, of the results of a ranking of these definitions by content teachers, and English teachers, they were defining an ecosystem, and the first definition was always was always rated lower by all the teachers compared to all the other texts, right? That's why it has a 0. And the definition at the bottom was the top of a top. It was always rated higher compared to all the other definitions. Remember that one is compared to this one and then with another one, and then, you know, there's multiple combinations. So the one at the bottom was considered to be the best, right? So what is this dialogue that we wanted to have with content teachers and language teachers? We wanted to then talk about why, you know, what has happened, right? Why did you rank one text lower or... So we first looked at the texts ourselves. We looked at the definitions ourselves. We saw here that, for example, the lowest rated, it was not structured as definition, no class. It was not correct in terms of language. The 2 lower rated, structured as definition, but no class and no abstractions. Then the higher rated texts, abstractions, generalizations, scientific information, expansions. Okay, so we saw expansions. And then we saw the highest rated one was the typical canonical definition, including, you know, the different parts, what you would find in the textbook, right? So this was interesting information then to prepare the work with the teachers. So here we really wanted to engage in dialogue about these texts, definitions in this case, but we also did it with other cognitive discourse functions. And here we really move from multidisciplinary to interdisciplinary, because we're building dialogue together. We're not using our own perspective. Here we're sharing perspectives, right? So for example, a content teacher said, well, this is low because an ecosystem is not only living things, right? So obviously from a content perspective. But content teachers also said things like this, because of the language. So it's low because of the language, and I think it's got nothing to do with what an ecosystem is. So, okay, it has nothing to do with what an ecosystem is, but also because of the language. So the content teacher was thinking about language as well, because they were put in this context together with language colleagues, and they were looking at things from a different perspective from the one that you have in your own classroom, your own discipline, or even maybe most often, you know, in meetings with colleagues from your own discipline, right? So things like this were happening. Or language teachers talking about how content is organized, right? How content is organized. And there are spelling mistakes, but I wouldn't mark it lower, right? So even language teachers who are, of course, spelling is important in the language class, but thinking about language also, not so strictly about language forms only, but also considering other things, right? Right, so we moved on. We moved forward. So we thought that comparative judgment was a good method. Although it's been used for assessment purposes, we were using it as a kind of starting point for dialogue and collaboration. And we thought that cognitive discourse functions was something that would work, because in every classroom, students are expected to define or to explain or to evaluate or to explore, etc. So we move on into transdisciplinary work. So we started multiple disciplines, but separately, interdisciplinary, dialogue, sharing, and then transdisciplinary, really producing something together, right? And here's when we come to the development of activities, such as this activity on chemistry by content teachers and English teachers. It was by one content teacher, one chemistry teacher, and one English teacher, where they looked at the resources that were necessary for different cognitive discourse functions in the topic of the periodic table. Okay, so they were really now, after reflecting on the needs, they were really getting together to produce activities. And in the third seminar, then the teachers went a step forward. They did not only design tasks together, but they implemented them in the classroom together. This was an activity, a lovely activity designed by a biology teacher and an English teacher after working on the water cycle. And so this was an activity that was presented to the students as belonging both to the English class and the biology class. So it was going to be assessed both by the biology teacher and the English teacher. So it was very creative. It was about imagine a day, or describe a day in the life of a drop of water. So it was creative for the English. The English teacher wanted to use the genre of a narration, including some evaluative aspects. So in terms of cognitive discourse functions, the students were expected to report, also describe what happened in the different stages, and also evaluate the effect of a poor drop of water falling into a polluted river. So it was really incorporating the CDFs, and the biology teacher expected the students to incorporate all the sequences of a water cycle, the whole cycle, and the English teacher expected the students to follow the structure and the language corresponding to this genre. And then, in this case, the teachers judged the students' answers, the students' texts, but also the students judged their own texts. Of course, they were anonymized, right? They didn't know. And they were not used in the same class. Like, there were two groups, so the texts from one class were taken to the other class, and so on, so that they did not see their own texts, even though they were, they were anonymized. So this is an example. On the left, you have an example of a text that was rated highest always by the biology teachers, the English teachers, and the students, the top of the top, right? So it was always rated highest, because comparative judgment allows you to see whether there, as we saw, there are, differences or similarities in the judgments by the different groups. And in this case, we included the students, right? Hello, I'm Susie, a small drop of water. I'm going to give you a description of my personal experience during the water cycle. So it's a lovely story about, the different, well, I'm not going to read the whole text, of course, but for example, in the second part, the second column, my journey continued towards my real home, the ocean. It was very disappointed to see the horrible life that living things. So it's really presenting all the stages of a water cycle, but then making it really creative into a narration, a creative narration. And on the other hand, you got texts like the one there that was rated lowest by biology teachers, English teachers, and students, right? So when we compared teachers and students' judgments, we saw, of course, that as expected, content teachers focus mostly on content, language teachers focused mainly on language. We found that the students mainly focused more on the aspects that the English teacher paid attention to. And the same, we used also another dimension of LCT that looks at the using, knowledge, specific knowledge related to the content, or more procedural knowledge. And the content teachers focus more on the specific knowledge. English teachers and students look at more general aspects like the structure of the text, so the students were more, let's say, their perceptions of what a good text was more similar to what English teachers expected. So that's something that is also important to take into account when this joint task was developed both by the biology teacher and the English teacher. Okay. Right, so just to finish, just some ideas that in a couple of studies that we just recently published from our research group, Tom Morton and Nashwan Ashatsopi, and another article with Tom and Rachel on this work with the teachers, right? This collaborative work with the teachers, and how increasing teachers' awareness of functional aspects of a language in relation to their subject areas is important to sort of enable them to apply more integrative assessment criteria, because sometimes content teachers, when they're they're asked to pay attention to language, they tend to look at language forms, which is fine, okay? But then that means that in many cases, students, for example, who attend language classes outside school, they are, of course, at an advantage because their English is better than those that do not have these private language classes outside school. So somehow that content teachers see the role of language for the expression of content, and including also language forms, but having a more general view, a more functional view of the role of language rather than just language forms. And we think this can lead to also issues related to equity and giving unjust advantage to students who have this opportunity because their families pay for language classes and they have money to send them to the UK or the United States or whatever to improve their English. And then also working with teachers together as researchers, we found how they became, like they started talking about concepts such as CDFs and the semantic dimension of legitimation theory. For example, this was in these discussions, dialogue with the English teacher and content teacher. English teacher said, density, an existing density, very low density. So, like, it was very simple way, right, of expressing the content that the student was trying to express. And then some of us asked, so would you expect more subject-specific terms? And the content teachers, yes, semantic density is just very, very low, right? But how, this is good because it's a meta-language, we shared a meta-language, right? And they seem to really see the point. But then the important thing is transferring this declarative knowledge to the procedural teacher domain so that they can apply this meta to the actual practice, right? So this is really important. But at least, we found that this was really working. So, literacies, functional, disciplinary, general academic literacies, plural literacies, and now this recent model of multilingual disciplinary literacies. We need to find a way of really bringing all these complex sort of literacy variables and angles in collaborative work with content, language, teachers, students, and researchers. And this idea of moving from a multidisciplinary, each of them looking at it from their expertise, looking at the same product, same text, same piece of text from their different perspectives as a starting point to then move into more, sharing perspectives and then developing activities together. I think it's really, really important and it worked really well. You can just start providing them with tasks from the beginning that are interdisciplinary without getting teachers first to look at it from their perspective and then see, oh, so this is how I see it. And then I can then start talking about it, and incorporating other perspectives later. And this is, also this is another of the targets of quality education equity, right? And this, I think this also has implications for this. And so we've done a lot of work on this, how getting CLIL teachers actively involved in research, and we've seen that using models which may seem very abstract and theoretical and that only researchers can use, can actually be used with the teachers, right? And of course, not all of them, but some of them can. And I think it gives them a basis, right, of really looking at the students' production through a certain lens, through a certain perspective, and also it has to be something that can be shared by different types of teachers and with researchers. But of course, we haven't really looked at what is the effect of all these on students' production, right? So we need really, this is challenging. You really need long-term sort of work with teachers to be able to see whether that really has an effect, and then comparing control groups, experimental groups. But we're looking into that in very, very small case studies and seeing with teachers. We've already carried out specific seminars on CDFs and the characteristics of CDFs with content and English teachers, and we are measuring the effect of that on students' texts and compared also with the texts that the students did following the same prompt but without this intervention. So looking at these kind of possible effects. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anna. It's great project. I think it's always nice to learn about these projects that somehow instantiate knowledge transfer and try to build bridges between disciplines that are neighboring. Excellent. So now we've got time for questions, comments. So yeah, Do, go ahead. Maria.
Hi. Yes. Okay. Thanks. Thanks ever so much. I've got a question about, if I've understood correctly, you were working with a group of teachers for like a year. Okay. What is happening to those teachers now? No, I mean, it's not meant to be a trick question. It's a genuine. What is happening to them now?
Well, some of those teachers are now participating in research projects. Like, in the COS project, in this European project, there are active participants there. And in another project that we are at more national level, working with bilingual schools in Spain. So, but that's, so this is a really good question though, because there were 3 seminars, 3 years really, right? So I'll show you that slide again. So it was 3 years.
And how many teachers were in each year?
So there were about 8 teachers in each year, so you were really reaching a very small number of teachers, right? So first year, 8 teachers, though from that year, 2 teachers repeated on the second year, because the first year we did it with teachers from different schools, different educational levels, and different subjects. And one teacher said, I want to implement this in my school. She was a coordinator of a bilingual program. So seminar 2 and seminar 3, they were carried out in one school and incorporating teachers from different subject areas. So the first one was really from different schools, and the second one and third one was only one school. And then there were about 10 teachers, content teachers, English teachers, biology, technology, physical education. And they were, okay, we already were at stage 2 because we had already worked with, so we had to really start with what we did the first year in a, we already had the experience, so we did it in a bit more, let's say, rapid way. So we got them to the first year, for example, it was difficult for them to understand what this comparative judgment was all about, right? They didn't understand it. But the second year, because 2 of the teachers participating in the first seminar took part in the second seminar, they were the ones spreading the word, like saying, oh, don't worry. At the beginning, it doesn't make sense, but then it's really interesting. So they were really helping us somehow to sell the kind of activity of that. So we were able then to move a little bit further and get them to design activities. And the last year, they even implemented. So there were not, in the 3 years, the teachers were not all the same, but there were 2 teachers that continued for the 3 years. And these 2 teachers are now participating in research studies. Yeah, but 2 teachers. So all these months and years. And what about the rest? Exactly. I mean, we were lucky because these seminars gave the teachers credits, like extra credits that they need to be able to stay in the school that they want to. It gave them points, let's say. But even with that, it's a big commitment, because even if it's once a month, it's after the school time. So they had to stay at school from 4 to 6 or 3:30 to, we adapted to them. We went there to the school, which was also very important, not online, but there, and then starting as soon as possible so that they could stay that day, have lunch, and then move on. So a big effort, but it worked really well. But your question is very relevant because it reached a very small number of teachers, really. Right? Yeah.
I guess it's quite hard to get teachers involved.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. Do you have any
I'm a teacher, and I was very lucky to participate in CLIL literacies.
And I think that it's very difficult to get us to participate, but just, it's not because we don't want to, but it's just we don't have the time.
Yeah, exactly.
We need baliabideak. We need the resources. We
We're
need
aware
the
of
time.
that.
We
Yes,
need
yes.
because we are willing to. And we see that this is good for our students, and that is our main purpose. Not all the teachers, I know, but most of us. That's right.
We've got another question over here.
as you are like carrying out your work in Madrid, I would like you to tell us about the situation of this bilingualism program in Madrid, which has been over for like 20 years, I think, more or less. So in the last years, like I saw like many schools are abandoning that system because they are quite critical with it, because they've seen the consequences. And for example, there was like, I think the Ministry of Education there, like they said, for example, geography and history, it wasn't a good subject for this kind of CLIL teaching, because they were observing like the knowledge was like alarmingly decreasing. So yeah, maybe they started to say, okay, maybe these subjects are not appropriate for this. And yeah, in the early stages of education as well, you were talking about equity. So I think there are lots of problems. So I would like you to give us your opinion about the consequences, about maybe the future of this.
Thank you. I mean, the research that we've done on the Madrid bilingual education program shows that some of the criticisms are really true. For example, this streaming at secondary school, you know, when the students get to secondary school and then they're streamed in these two groups, which in principle, you know, you can present it in a positive way, like everybody's doing CLIL, no matter how, your level of English is. But this really creates like the good ones, the CLIL good ones, and the CLIL not so good ones, right? And we've seen it actually with teachers not thinking that they were doing different things and then actually engaging the good ones, same subject, in a different way, in a less factual way, but more engaging, more critical thinking, and so on. So this is really showing that this streaming creates problems. The students are not learning enough. The research, real research, shows, and I supervise a doctoral thesis, a very, very solid doctoral thesis working with many schools, about 6 schools, 6 secondary schools, a lot of data in different parts of Madrid. She's a history teacher, right? So a CLIL history teacher, and looking at content and language integration, and she shows that there's no difference in content learning. In fact, the Comunidad de Madrid took that decision, saying that, that they don't learn so much, and the research community asked, where's the evidence? They didn't answer. Then there was this movement by teachers, the academics, we also contributed, of course, and students and families, and they decided this decision of social science is not going to be taught through English anymore. They went back and they said, okay, only the topics related to the history of Spain cannot be taught through English. So they realized, really, and because the press, they interviewed me and other people, and what do you think? I said, well, have you asked the Comunidad de Madrid where the evidence is that they learn less? Yes, we have. And where's the evidence? They don't have any evidence. So it's really these kind of things of social media. So there are things that really are not working well, but this idea that they don't learn as much, well, if they learn the history of Spain in English, they're not going to be able to use some terms in English, in Spanish, but in English. Okay, if you consider that learning less, I agree. They say Philip II and not Felipe II. Well, you know, as a mother, I don't care, you know, but if you do care, then they're learning less. But the reality, if you look at learning really history, and, you know, and there's this thesis which really shows that they learn the same. They really learn the same. There were no difference, no statistical differences at all. And this is in the Comunidad de Madrid program. So, yes, some things are working very badly and other things are not working badly, but there is this thing about social media, you know, solo, and the press and certain groups, because unfortunately in Madrid, bilingual education has become very politicized, right? So those that are on one side, everything that has been done by Pepe is not good, and Pepe, everything that is, so we know what it's like, so. Anyway, but thanks for the question, because it's an important question.
We've got another question, Eneko. Thank you.
Hi, my question is, well, it's related to what he said, and it has to do with, well, allow me to, yeah, I'm nervous. So everything has a cultural dimension, and when I realized that I had a Moroccan girlfriend, everything is full of culture, even if we don't see it. So I wonder if you have ever thought to, with some colleagues or anything, about adding culturally diverse teachers to your research to see how their view on the content is reflected throughout the results.
That's a really interesting research question. No, we haven't studied that. So you're thinking, we have started, because now we've moved to doing research with another program, not the Comunidad de Madrid program, but the Ministry of Education British Council program, which has schools in different parts of Spain. And there are schools in interesting places like Melilla and Ceuta, where the population is, well, very different from, for example, schools in Zaragoza or in the Balearic Island. There is a school there which is already, of course, trilingual because they have Catalan and so on. So we're looking at, a doctoral student in our group is looking precisely at these schools in Ceuta and Melilla, because the program is the same. It's a very sort of, so the program is the same in all these different schools in different parts of Spain, but the population, there are a lot of students there who speak Arabic, and their background is Arabic and then Spanish. So it's really interesting. So they're looking into that. But the teachers, this is interesting. I don't know. We haven't really thought about that. So you're thinking of teachers coming from different backgrounds, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And also how...
That's a good question.
Yeah, also I think that when you mentioned all the SDGs and everything on there was one that you mentioned about global citizenship.
Yes, yes.
And how that can contribute to both students and teachers' global citizenship, because we often forget that the teachers can also get to be global citizens. It's not just for children, it's not just for
Very
students.
good point.
So
Yeah,
teachers
yeah.
can be...
Very good
also-
point. Yeah, sure. Well, you can study that.
Maybe in another life, yeah. Thank you.
I think that we have to stop here so that our next speaker can start. Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.